anybody else wanting a seat? I don't know why I'm cupping my hand to my mouth. Anybody else? Everybody finding something? Awesome. Okay, so I'm talking about that. I'm Lewis Cowper, both here and on the internet. Thank you for having Scottish names. I'm a junior front-end developer at HitFox here in Berlin, and we're there on Twitter, and I'm there on Twitter. So if you have any questions or comments, I'll be most responsive over Twitter or later on. So I'm here tonight to talk about modularizing all the things. We've heard a long time for web components, for Polymer, built on top of web components, React. Everything in JavaScript is moving toward making a modular UI, and up until fairly recently, you couldn't really do CSS with it. You could put your CSS into JavaScript, but that comes with its own drawbacks. So I'll talk about the principles behind CSS modules and take you through a tiny bit of code to help you understand what the project's kind of about. So I find it really interesting that no matter what level we look at, regardless of whether you're back-end, DevOps, front-end, design, everything winds up compressing down into bits, because bits are really easy to understand. You can understand a header from Facebook, from Google, it doesn't matter, you just have it. And we always see repeated attempts at making these reproducible things, even right down to containers and VMs and everything. And that gives us a separation of concerns, where the header just needs to be concerned about what goes on in the header. And it's really fascinating to me. And as I've been trying to learn web development, and as I say, I'm a junior web developer, so there's no doubt many people in here that know a lot more about this than me, but a big part of that becomes learning how to and when you want to refactor into a more general function, or make a class, or make your thing a component instead of, just spraying it out onto the page. And while I was procrastinating writing this talk, I went on a Wikipedia binge and discovered philosophy. It's pretty cool, right? And I discovered reductionism, which is a broad philosophical term for everything about simplifying things, abstracting things, and making things more easy to understand. And it's about the connections between phenomena, which is a philosophical term that I genuinely can't properly define, but it's things that you control that happen. And they've also got these things called epiphenomena. So if a phenomenon happens, this could be really difficult to say, if a phenomenon happens and it causes a side effect, you get an epiphenomena. So reading that as a programmer, I'm going, oh my God, philosophy is explaining functional programming to me. This is fantastic. And thinking like this in a purely abstract sense allows you to think about things in your application without those kind of narrow glasses on what your application is actually doing. You just think, should it be doing this? Is it doing this? What do I want it to do? And it's really nice. And yeah, often this is another quote from Wikipedia, often there's an implication that the epiphenomenon exerts no causal agency on the fundamental phenomena that explain it. And that's like built CSS from a preprocessor. The CSS doesn't care about the Sass, the CSS just is CSS. And it's a side effect of you compiling, which is really cool. And I feel like we've got a few phenomena in our daily lives as people working within the web, and your CSS, whether preprocessor or not, your markup, and by extension, your class and ID structure, and the browser that the user is viewing your page in, and all the environmental issues that extend that, whether that's ad blockers or no script or anything like that. They're all, all phenomena. And the whole construction of the DOM, the CSS object model, and just the look of the website itself are the epiphenomena. So these are the side effects of constructing all of your markup, all of your CSS, all of your JavaScript, and then you get a website. The two are linked, but the website doesn't care about what preprocessor you use. The website just cares about what it knows about. And yeah, that's really cool, but I'm kind of junior, so this whole CSS is awesome thing, if I don't know all of the CSS that's on the page, I often struggle and run into problems when somebody's not architected their CSS in a scalable way, because I change something that shouldn't affect anything else, and suddenly the entire layout's borked because I made something an inline block or something when it shouldn't be. And I think that this is usually the point where somebody slaps an important tag on, adds some selectors right at the bottom of the file because nobody can see them. And yeah, and it's not the right way we should be thinking about it. And I think everybody generally knows that, but it's quite difficult to do when you have to understand conventions and acronyms. Good God, there are so many acronyms. And what we need to do is figure out what everything is doing, figure out what side effects your thing is causing, and figure out how to make those side effects what you want, and leave us with the proper result and the intended result. So I've been looking for good ways to think about all the things that CSS can do and how to try and fix all the stuff that doesn't fit with my expectation. And I've heard about BEM and SMAX and ITS and SUIT, which I learned fairly recently, and other naming or architecting methods to reduce the cognitive overhead surrounding a large CSS project. However, they're all just conventions. If I don't know that your project is following BEM, I just think that some one person wrote it in that way. And that was their style, because I'm used to JavaScript, where it's just your style. And if you've got a linter, it can fix that, but without it, you can't. And oh, that's better. And all it takes is one person not reading the README or misunderstanding what layer of the inverted triangle that you're on, or a lax code review, which, to be fair, we've all had because we've needed to get something out the door. All of a sudden, regardless of how many acronyms you use to organize your CSS, it's all gone a bit wrong. And in my limited experience, CSS has real problems when multiple people of varying amounts of knowledge try to collaborate, because without lots of documentation and talks about the structure of the CSS, some CSS wizard or witch comes into the group and either becomes a bottleneck because they review everything, or becomes a bottleneck because they have to write all the CSS. And it's not scalable and it's not sustainable. So yeah, and the problem with that is people get left behind, whether it's a lax code review that doesn't explain a better way of doing the thing, or whether it's because they weren't actually writing the CSS themselves. People get left behind, and that makes your project completely inaccessible if you can't go through the gatekeeper. Either way, a lot of time is invested making the CSS as clear as possible, and at the end of the day, hopefully the team can feel like they leveled up their knowledge. That's the end goal, right? But unfortunately, up until very recently, there was no concrete tool-based way to solve these problems. We could lint till our heart's desire, but it doesn't change the fact that a linting error almost always will never be a breaking build change. You won't be able to not push if you've got a linting error. It'll just be like, ah, it's a warning, it's fine, go. And to create components along with our CSS, along with our JavaScript components in CSS that are logically clear and simple to understand without worrying about the numerous footguns that CSS has. If we follow the principles of reduction, we can reduce our cognitive load and start keeping your HTML CSS dependencies in code instead of in your head related to an acronym that I don't know what it stands for. So there are some goals of the internal architecture of good CSS. Styles should be scoped to a single component. Problem is, all CSS selectors are global, so you've really got to know what you're doing. So we need a convention for ensuring globally unique selectors. And this is a problem that BEM tries to solve by namespacing your class names in a very specific way. But frankly, I'm never entirely sure what the difference between a block and an element is, because if I'm not going right back to the beginning, I lose where I am in the structure and it all goes wrong. And it's little more than a convention. It's not a tool that says this is how it works. It's just, what do you think that should be called? Button, normal. Okay, cool, that works, and that's great. But what's the difference between a header image and a billboard? Hands up, anybody who knows, because I don't, and it depends on what you're going to use it for. And if you want to make these grand architectural decisions on your modules, you need to kind of think about what they're named. And that's really difficult to do when all you have to do is name a class. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to relate it to anything in the DOM or anything in your JavaScript that's creating the DOM. It's just a class. And when you start loading CSS into your JavaScript, and that's one of the fundamental features of Webpack, JSPM, and Browserify, is the ability to explicitly describe your file's dependencies regardless of the type. You can import CSS with require, and it just works. You have the right class names in your scope, and you can go. And it means that you can specify your CSS as a dependency, and it's guaranteed to be present, much like any other dependency. If you require underscore, you have underscore. It all works. But with great power comes great responsibility. And this is where a new spec comes in. By treating the CSS as a dependency of our JavaScript, we gain access to a fundamental new power. We can pass variables through from our CSS into JavaScript. So why is that a nice idea? So up the top, we require myComponent CSS. It doesn't seem entirely unreasonable. We just have a side effect that our CSS is loaded. But down here, var styles equals require, or because we're in 2015 and there's an ECMAScript standard named after it, we could use import styles from myComponent CSS. And then we have this styles object that we can apply potentially, in this case, a dynamically generated class name as an LM class. But the real thing is we have a thing in our JavaScript that we can manipulate, use, and scope locally to that component, which is really cool. And that's interoperable CSS. In order to help, I should have had a title there, that would have been much better. Big reveal. So if you want to help out, you can read the spec and speak to your loader of choice if it's not Webpack, JSPM, or Browserify, and see if they want to look at implementing it, try and implement it yourself. And just try out that idea, because it's really powerful. And the interoperable CSS bit is a specification that describes the mechanism by which the exported symbols are passed around before they get to your JavaScript component. I'm not really going to go any further, and if any of you want to watch a talk on from CSSConf, Glenn's doing one on interoperable CSS. It will be videoed and up. So that's really cool. But yeah, we should get back to CSS modules. That's what you came to see. So CSS modules, using my favorite logo. It's a new project that builds upon all of this and tries, it's an opinionated way of using interoperable CSS in your project. So it's about, it kind of tries to go in between all the people who want to use JavaScript to make their CSS, but without forgetting all the nice bits that CSS provides. So we have no more global scope pollution. Everything is local by default. Each file gets compiled separately, so your selectors can be completely simple and generic. The compilation will take care of the naming of things into this interoperable CSS format. And we can take advantage of the import and export pseudo selectors, which you can find out more about on ICSS, which are really cool. And I think they're like the main bit of the spec. Import, yeah, that's it. Import and export in CSS. It's super cool. So if we have a button, and with suit or BEM naming, we have button, button disabled, and these are all overrides for the thing, which then means we apply two classes, button and button in progress, when we want to style our button in an in progress way. And that's nice, but the only thing that provides a safety net that you're using the right button in this case is a naming convention. So with CSS modules, you would have a submit button component, normal, disabled, error, in progress styles. And then if you can all see at the back, I see people craning. So you import styles from this file, and then you have access to the class names as JavaScript properties. So you can have just styles.normal, and that styles a button with everything normal. But the one crucial difference is this is not all styles for normal and then overrides for disabled. This is all the styles that everything needs. And that sounds like it's going to be really verbose and you're going to have to keep typing, but there's an idea for that. It's how you, composition is how you represent shared styles within CSS modules. So let's look at some examples. So if you have common, all of the common styles that you want on your element, you can say normal composes common, and then add stuff for normal. You can do the same with disabled, the same with error, the same with in progress, and it means that each class is the only one that it needs. And yeah, so you can do this with extends in Sass, but Sass rewrites your selectors to make it work, whereas CSS modules changes which classes are exported in a really intelligent and nice way. And allows you to, yeah, do this. So with BEM, you have button and button in progress, but with CSS modules, you just have styles.inProgress. And it's really nice, and you can immediately tell the state of the thing based on the class, which is something that I think a lot of the BEM and suit and its and what have I forgotten? Smacks. You can tell the state really, really easily and really simply within your React component or web component or wherever. It's really nice. And because of this composes keyword, there's actually another really cool thing, which is inter-file cooperation and sharing. So let's say we've got this utils folder. If you've done CSS for a thing, you've probably got a brand variables folder that has your colors, like your brand's colors or whatever. And you have a load of helper classes in this. And within CSS modules, you can compose from other files, which is super powerful because you start describing what your module is rather than what it looks like. And it's really nice. And to me, from the JavaScript world, that reads well and is done within your CSS. You don't need to mess about with JavaScript to get that to work. With the interoperable CSS compilation, it just works. It's really nice. So composition is like a superpower because it lets you describe what an element is, not what styles make it up. And it's just a different way of mapping elements to rules. So let's have a look at some bog standard CSS out with all modules and everything. We have all these things. You've no doubt seen something similar to this somewhere. Everything is specified in full, despite the fact that we'll probably want to reuse these elsewhere. So let's use Sass variables and break this apart. So you've also probably seen something similar to this if you've done Sass. You just include and you have these dollar variables and they just work. So it's nice, it's an improvement, but we've only actually gotten rid of about half of the lines. And we've only taken out half of the lines. What I think about CSS modules, and this was frankly the little snippet that really sold it to me, was that you say, I want large from typography, dark text from colors, padding all medium from layout, and subtle shadow from effects. That's really nice, really expressive. Doesn't tread too far from CSS in itself, and it lends itself to having a lot of single-purpose files. And you use the file system to delineate styles of different purposes rather than just namespacing. In short, CSS modules may not be a tool that you immediately go away and convert all of your applications to, but it's definitely a step in the right direction toward making CSS less of a stressful thing, where few people really understand it, and mostly people are just hacking their way toward the visual layout that they want. And then somebody tries it on a device that they haven't considered, and suddenly everything's broken again. It allows newcomers to look at your code and understand what is coming from where, and even better, with a nice file layout, the names just read. Import large from typography, you're probably wanting large text there. That's awesome. It removes convention and tribal arcane knowledge from understanding your CSS architecture and is generally awesome. And I'll leave you with this. So every time you see somebody talk about CSS is dead, you know, let's all style in JavaScript in the browser. So think about it. This developer was probably afraid of CSS because they broke something. And then they got angry at CSS. And then they started hating CSS. And all of a sudden, we have to listen to their suffering because there isn't a really good way of fixing it. So for those of you who have seen Star Wars, CSS, HTML, JavaScript in your project is basically the Force, right? Bear with me. So with the right instructions, good mentorship, and a lot of discipline, you can do truly remarkable things. You can scale your CSS architecture without problems and focus your energy on the next big thing, or Padawan. And if all you have is convention, it can be really easy to let, just like a little exclamation mark important, just go in. You can just add some CSS to the bottom, but that way lies the dark side. And more hacks, and hacks on hacks on hacks. And it's so easy to let yourself, once you have a bit of knowledge, to just fall into that. And I like to think that the more our tooling can help, and the more likely we are to be able to take steps from the outset that make it so much easier to be a Jedi Master and use our powers for good. In short, modularize things, create phenomena instead of relying on epiphenomena. Thanks very much.